campus in Novato, California on 22nd April 2020, talking to Marc Kasky on the Presidio in San Francisco. Welcome, Marc.
It's good to be here, John. Good to see you again.
Yes, well, you're one of the few people that still calls me John. You're grandfathered in from back in the 70s.
You prefer Jack?
For friends, yeah, but
okay.
My sister can't make the transition.
Mm-hmm.
We go back to when I was first starting the Wellness Resource Center, and you were close friends with Annie, who was our bookkeeper, and I learned about your activities. You then went on to I believe, found the Fort Mason Foundation. I'm not sure of all the history. That's what I want to find out.
Sure.
But first of all, I want to find out who you are and why, and what led you to doing one of the more important things in wellness to create a lasting institution that has hosted lots of activities. And you're quite the man.
Well, thank you.
That's still going.
The
Wellness Resource Center didn't last very long at all.
Well, we could even think of Fort Mason Center as the wellness resource center.
Yes, it certainly is that. So where were you born, and what siblings, birth order, the background?
Okay, I was born in 1944. In fact, 3 days ago, I turned 76. 5 days ago, I turned 76.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I was born in the Bronx, New York, and lived in Parkchester for the first couple of years of my life. Then moved when I was about 2.5 to White Plains, New York, where we stayed for about 2 years. And then our family moved to Stamford, Connecticut when I was about 5, which is where I grew up. And my family remained. I was a pretty active athlete as a young man. I can mention one of the formative experiences in my early childhood was when I was about 4.5. We lived in White Plains, and my parents felt I was ready for kindergarten. But they wouldn't allow me to start kindergarten in White Plains until I was 5. So in 1948, my mother would put me on a train in the White Plains, and I would go alone into the Bronx to go to school every day.
Wow.
And this is, of course, something that a parent now would be arrested for child neglect or abuse. But I realized years later, many years later, that experience created a sense of trust and comfort in the world and how I would be treated in the world. That was significant, although I didn't realize it consciously at the time. Unconsciously and subconsciously, it affected the path I took and the way I addressed the world. And then when I thought back and realized how people would say, you seem so comfortable, you trust people. I didn't question it for years. It was just so. And then I had this realization that it was connected to that very early experience.
Plus the competence of being able to do something like that.
Yeah. I asked my mother how long. She said, you did it for 6 months until we moved to Connecticut. And then they made me go to kindergarten again because I still wasn't old enough for first grade. But I got the benefit of 2 years of kindergarten, which I'm sure didn't hurt. So I was an athlete, baseball, basketball, cross country in high school. I was president of my class in 9th grade and president of my class in 11th grade.
Wow.
Undefeated in elections. I retired from politics undefeated. And
siblings, were you oldest, youngest?
I have an older sister who is 4 years older and a younger brother 2 years younger. And we are in regular communication. Our parents lived until my father 94 and my mother 98. So my mother died 8 years ago and my father died 15 years ago. So we had the benefit of a long experience with them. And part of the benefit for me was watching someone that I knew intimately age and observe the things that made it easier or harder for them in aging. And decided to learn from those experiences and incorporate them so that I could take advantage of the pluses of aging and minimize the things that could be minimized in the downside of aging. So that was important to have my parents around that long. And one of the things about, I was loved as a child, and I felt very deeply. I knew from the moment I was born, I felt well received. In fact, I had in a meditation several years ago. I mean, is this okay to continue talking in this direction?
Oh yeah, this is it. That's what I want.
In a meditation here at the house, the cat and I would, my wife and I would have these group meditations periodically. I saw my birth, and it wasn't a rebirth experience. It was just observing my birth. And what I observed was my parents, when I came out, saying, "We're so glad you're here."
Wow.
And whether that was literally true or not, that's what I felt.
Yeah.
And so I asked my mother about this a couple years later. Was Dad present at my birth, and what was it like? And she confirmed, not the words, but that this was, she said it felt like God had arrived. He was so pleased. He was so happy to see you. So that's been a significant advantage that I feel I've had in living my life, is to have started out with parents who really loved me from the first day and just wanted me to be happy. And
so rare in this culture.
it is. And I don't take that for granted. I thank my parents to this day in meditations, just for that start in life, and that not only the start, but that continued. And for the last, I'd say 15 years of their lives, I called my parents every day, literally every day, because I just wanted to say, "Hi, how are you?" My father would answer the phone. I'd say, "Hi, handsome." And he'd say, "Hi, my beautiful son." And it was just a great ritual, basically. So anyway, that was a very significant, has been a very significant part of how I've approached life.
Yeah.
So I graduated high school and went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut, which I was a very good student in high school and thought that college would be an opportunity to just get 4 years older, because I felt I knew everything I needed to know. I just needed to grow 4 years older, and had a rude awakening in my first semester at college when I took a science exam and studied very hard, thought I did okay, not well, and the test came back and it had a number on it, and the number was 7. So I went to see the professor to find out if this was a 70 or what, and he said, no, it was a 7, and out of 100. And it was stunning. I walked out of his office after the conversation across campus saying, I'll never survive here. This is too hard. I mean, there's no way to recover from a 7 and get a passing grade. If that's indicative of what I'm going to be experiencing in the rest of my academic life there, it was hopeless. Again, reflecting years, I graduated from Wesleyan. I didn't do well, but I graduated. And what I learned, again, unconsciously at the time, but consciously several years later, was I learned how to navigate a situation that was too difficult for me on its face, and how to find a path through that successfully, productively. And that's been characteristic of my life. I mean, I look at situations and I say, okay, figure out a way to, quote, navigate through this. There is a way. Just think, don't be worried that there isn't a path. Just find it. And I've been able to date, find paths through essentially all the projects I've taken on, the relationships I've had, the decisions that I've had to make, or wanted to make, rather. So that was something that was important that I got unconsciously at Wesleyan, that I'm grateful to that place for, in addition to the friendships.
What was your major?
I majored in economics and government. And of course, when I graduated in '66, if you didn't go to graduate school, you would wind up in Vietnam. So I was determined to go to graduate school. And the summer before graduation, I went to Washington, D.C. with my brother And he found a job there, and I found a job in the redevelopment agency of Washington, D.C., just knocking on doors. And determined after that summer, I liked the people I met, I liked the subject. I decided to go to city planning school for a graduate degree. And I applied to Yale, Columbia, and Penn, and Delft in Holland. Someone had recommended that school. I had very poor grades at Wesleyan. I got turned down at Wesleyan, at Yale, Columbia, and Penn, and got accepted at Delft. And I got at the acceptance letter, it said, for the first 6 months, you'll be able to take your courses in English, but after that, you'll need to take them in Dutch. And they included a book, Self-Taught Dutch. And I looked at it and I said, no, this isn't going to work. So this was in the summer after graduation. I collected my transcripts and a couple of recommendations and went to NYU, just walked into the admissions office and asked if there was someone there to talk to, explained my situation, gave them my letters of recommendation and my transcript, and then went to the University of Michigan and did the same thing. Just walked into the admissions office. This was in the summer, and wound up getting accepted at both of these universities. So I went back home, and at my parents' store one day, the person who advised me on selecting a college said, well, where do you really want to go? And I said, well, I really want to go to Yale. He said, go back and tell them that. And I resisted. I was upset that I said, they rejected me. Why would they change their mind? And I went home, thought about it, and decided there's nothing to lose. All they can do is say no a second time. So I drove up to New Haven from Stanford and went into the admissions office, asked if there was someone there, and I told them I had been rejected. I asked them if they could tell me why I was rejected. Literally, this is pretty much a literal, characterization of the conversation. And they got my file out and they said, your grades were too low. And I asked what my grades would need to be, and they said, you'd need to have had an 85. And I said, I could have gotten an 85 if I had taken easy courses. We all know that there are easy courses in college. I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I took difficult courses. And as a result, my average was low, but I worked hard. And literally a week later, they sent me an acceptance letter.
Ah.
And so I went to Yale for graduate school and studied city planning there. And that was in '66. In January of '68, when I was I just completed my third semester out of 4. This was when the McCarthy campaign was starting in New Hampshire. And friends of mine at Yale had signed up to do weekend volunteer work. And one of them who had signed up couldn't go, so he asked me if I would go in his place. And I did, drove up there. When I arrived, they mistakenly, I thought I was a person who was there to open up a headquarters in one of the towns that didn't have a campaign yet. So they sent me to northern New Hampshire with the mission to rent an office, start a campaign, and run the campaign there. So I went up to this small town in northern New Hampshire, Berlin, New Hampshire, and scoped it out, walked around town for a few days, rented a store. I mean, I was 23 years old, completely no involvement in politics, but anti-war at the time, very much opposed. And McCarthy was challenging Johnson. He was the only one who was standing up to Johnson at the time. So I opened up a campaign headquarters, and long story short, I stayed for 5 weeks, dropped out of graduate school, and had a great deal of success. Our town McCarthy won our town, and the campaign asked me to stay on. And so I went to Nebraska and Oregon and California and worked through the entire campaign, opening up headquarters, speaking to citizens groups, recruiting students as volunteers, doing a bunch of things, and wound up it being written about in the McCarthy Historical Project at Georgetown University and documented in a couple of books, the nature of how I worked in this particular situation. And this was validating to my approach to life, which is being open, trusting, curious, wanting to enjoy myself, trusting if I'm happy, I'm doing something right. So I left the campaign at the end of the campaign because it became more pure politics at that point rather than what they call retail politics, dealing with people right at the street level. And I signed up for Peace Corps and got accepted into Peace Corps and went to Los Angeles to do a training program in city planning to go to Venezuela. I was in a training program for 10 weeks, realized that the particular project that they were going to be assigning me to was not one that it felt like I'd be designing utility routes and roads and stuff like that for people that owned real estate that wanted these services delivered to them so that they could develop their real estate. And that wasn't what I had envisioned the Peace Corps being for me. I thought more like building schools or building community facilities, et cetera. So I quit the training program, having been there for 10 weeks and learned Spanish quite well, and hitchhiked through Mexico for 3 months on my own, knocking on doors, introducing myself to families in different towns, saying I'd like to stay with a family to learn the language better and to learn about the culture. And every town I went to, either the first or the second door I knocked on, people welcomed me in and treated me like I was accustomed to being treated here in the US, which was with trust and warmth and generosity. And it was a profound experience because it was me seeing myself from a larger context, really getting a sense of what, I'll call it my gift or my talent was, which was eliciting trust and confidence and openness. And that was a big deal for me because to encounter that here in the US was one thing, and it was meaningful. To encounter it in a completely foreign culture sort of deepened the sense that this was so. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I carried into my personal relationships, my work relationships, my thoughts about how to live my life immediately in the near future and in the long-term future. So I came back from Mexico and still had to do something to avoid the draft. And I really was doing this to avoid the draft and trying to be constructive in how I avoided the draft, not just dropping out. Mm-hmm. So I signed up for VISTA, which was the domestic Peace Corps essentially, and wound up going to Cleveland, Ohio, and working for a year there in community development, which helped me use some of what I'd learned in city planning. And even though I decided not to be a city planner because I saw how traditionally city planners would come up with a plan and either politicians or developers or both would then turn it into something very different than what I would have done. And so I felt that from a disposition standpoint, that would not be something particularly satisfying to me. So, but this community development work that I was doing in an urban neighborhood in Cleveland, an African-American neighborhood, the Huff neighborhood, which was about 98% African-American. And the work there with housing and with health, with education, with community services of various types was really rewarding. And I learned a lot about how to make that, how to work in that environment, and how to make something constructive happen. And the biggest lesson from it, which has affected me to this very day, was I earned $192 a month. And I had an apartment that I shared with 2 other guys. We had a 3-bedroom apartment. And at the end of the stay in Vista, I said, something profound has just happened. I've just found out that going forward, I don't have to look for a job that pays me the best. I need to only find something that I really want to do, that I'll enjoy doing, that I can grow from, and know that no matter what, it can't pay me less than I've been earning here in Cleveland. And seriously, I said, that's a very liberating experience to realize I was happy, productive, earning $192 a month, and I could find something where I felt I'd be happy and productive and not worry about how much it was going to pay me. So that's literally to this very day. I take on projects where I get paid nothing, or where it's not clear whether I'll get paid or how much I'll get paid, as long as I feel like this is something I'm going to be happy and productive doing. So after leaving Vista, I went to work for Dartmouth College in an urban education center that they were going to start in the Model Cities neighborhood in, of all places, Jersey City, New Jersey, to have a Dartmouth presence in Jersey City. So I was the associate director of this education center, which was a house that was renovated. And it was going to house Dartmouth students who came to Jersey City from the education department to work in local schools. And my job was to facilitate the relationship with the local schools and to work with students in the neighborhood who could come to our house, which became a tutoring center. The students from Dartmouth would form relationships with students in these local schools, and the kids would come over for tutoring after school and at night. I worked in that project for almost 2 years and felt I was done, and hitchhiked across country for 6 months to just experience the US basically, and to walk, hitchhike, and camp. And again, part of that experience, which, it's all kept accumulating, it was cumulative, trusting that I could just stick my thumb out and everything would be okay, doing it for an extended period of time, and then meeting people who invited me into their home, told me about places to go in the area where I was heading, where they were dropping me off, bringing me to their retreat center where I would stay for a week and help them build something. I mean, meeting people from all different backgrounds, all different cultures, and again, feeling safe and learning what I could from that experience. I arrived in California and decided to look for work. And as it turned out, I found a job in Portland, Oregon, starting a nonprofit called the Volunteer Corps. And it was recruiting volunteers from corporations, local corporations, to work in neighborhood projects. But not just recruiting volunteers, recruiting teams of volunteers in a particular corporation to select a project that I bring them 3 or 4 projects from the community. Senior drop-in centers, teen tutoring clinics, health projects, recreational projects. And they would then pick one of the projects that they wanted to work on. And because they were all from this one corporation, they would bring their various skills, the planners, the finance people, the marketing people, the programming people. So there was a team, a resource team that was available to a project that they never could have assembled on their own. And I basically would then hire someone to coordinate that team with that project and then go on to the next, find another project, find another corporation, recruit someone to coordinate it, and then move on. And I did that for about a year.
And you started that on your own?
Well, there was a branch in San Francisco, and that's who I met. And they then said, we want to start a project in Portland. We'd like you to start it. So I moved to Portland. Mm-hmm. And I always felt, at this time in my life, John, it was Jack, rather, excuse me. It was really interesting because I was spending 1 or 2 years in each different place that I was living, meeting people, working on a project, working long enough at it to feel like I'd accomplished something, that I'd learned something from it and feel done, having met friends in that community, but still felt free to then leave and move to the next place. And one of the fantasies that I had at that point was, I could do this for the next 50 years and live in 25 different places, 2 years each, and just work on a project, learn from it, contribute to its success, meet people, have relationships, and move on. And it was kind of it was a very romantic image, and I felt it was a legitimate plan. I wasn't committed to it, but I felt like this could happen and it would be a pretty good thing because so far it was very satisfying and very rewarding and productive. So anyway, I moved back to New Hampshire for a relationship. I was on the East Coast and she wouldn't move to Portland, so I moved back east and got a job at Franconia College in New Hampshire, a small college, 400 students, where a man named Leonard Botstein was the president. And they had hired him as the college was about to go out of existence as a 23-year-old genius to help at least one last shot at seeing whether they could keep this college afloat. The college was located in sort of central New Hampshire, and it was very much at odds with the culture of New Hampshire at that time. New Hampshire was a very conservative, place, very conservative, very narrow-minded. And this college had been subject to state police busting them for drugs and sex activities. And the college wanted to reform and establish a relationship with the surrounding communities. And I was hired to help make that happen. And so I looked around to see, what would be a project that might engage the college with the communities around it. And, thought about the traditional kinds of projects. And then I realized that this was 1973 and 4. This was the beginning of cable television. And the local communities had cable television service because they were in the White Mountains, but they didn't have any local television. It was all cable from outside, Maine, New York, Massachusetts, etc. So I went to the cable company and said, how about giving me a channel, and I will develop a local television station for you that will focus on the life here in this community. And they said, give me a description of what you would propose doing. So I gave them, interviews with high school students who had done interesting projects, the local organic gardener, musicians and artists, Little League baseball, local political issues, a variety of history of the town. And so they said yes. They gave me a whole channel. So suddenly I had a 24-hour-a-day channel available to me 7 days a week to produce programming. And I recruited students from the college. And we called it, of course, their real television. And the students understood this was not their idea. This was not what they wanted to put on. We were serving the community to help them hold up a mirror, essentially, to themselves. It was a phenomenal success. People I would walk around, I was the host of the station. And so I was like Johnny Carson in Littleton, New Hampshire. It was really, and I was, again, at that point, I was maybe 29 or 30 years old. And we did 9 hours of programs a week, which was a lot given no money, I borrowed equipment. And so that was the project I worked on there, except there was one other thing, which was these students suddenly started getting ambitious about certain things, and they wanted to start a basketball team at Franconia College. And they kept asking people to be their coach, but the students were sort of, marijuana smoking, dropout kind of students, and nobody took them seriously. So I told the president of the college that I had been a basketball player in college. If they asked me, I would say yes. And so they did. I agreed to be their coach. They bought uniforms with the student, affairs budget. The whole, like the Los Angeles Lakers, all gold, warm-up uniforms, etc. And we announced that we had a team, and we scheduled games against other colleges in the Northeast. But the first 2 games were canceled because of snow, and it looked like we might have a problem getting anybody to come up to visit us during the winter. So I said, we will play all our games away. We'll go to whoever will allow us to come play at their court. And on the way down to our first game, I thought, we don't have a nickname yet. So could we be the Franconia Maple Leafs or what? So we tried to think about it. And then I thought, wait a minute. If we're going to be playing all our games on the road at other people's gyms, why don't we call ourselves the Franconia Visitors? Because that way, every time we look up at the scoreboard, we'd see our name on the scoreboard. And this became the New York Times. I called Associated Press on the way home from the game, which we won, our first game, told them about this story, and it went on the Associated Press all over the country. I was getting phone calls, the New York Times, Sports Illustrated. The Franconia, the Visitors were this, sort of shooting star phenomenon. And that's when I left. Right soon after that, I hitchhiked cross country again, came back to San Francisco, and decided to live here again for 2 years. That was in 1975. And here I am 45 years later, thinking this would be another 2-year stop.
What happened to the Visitors? Did someone else take over and they continued their career?
you know, there wasn't the kind of communication that we have these days. And so I was traveling hitchhiking and I didn't maintain contact. I hope they did. I never did find out. I mean, my guess is they did.
Is the
Um,
college still in existence?
the college went out of business about 5 years later. It was just a struggle. You know, it was a very difficult time for a small college, and they didn't survive. Um,
Hmm.
but it was a great experiment, and I certainly had a. I mean, between the television station, living in the woods, and being a college basketball coach, was really, even for a brief time, it was a lot of fun. And so I moved to San Francisco, and a friend of mine said that he had been the director of the Ecology Center, and it was about to close. It was the second ecology center in the country to open after Berkeley Ecology Center, after Earth Day, which is tomorrow. It was 1970, 1970 was the first Earth Day, I believe.
Yes.
So this is the 50th anniversary. And this ecology center had started soon after that, but it was struggling and it was about to close. And it was located downtown San Francisco, right across the street from the Transamerica Pyramid, on the edge of Chinatown, North Beach, the Financial District, and the Design Center. It had a fabulous storefront location, but it was dying. He said, if I can get the board of directors to commit to paying you for 6 months, will you take a job and try to get this place back on its feet? So for $600 a month, which was a livable, I knew it was a livable wage, even in San Francisco in those days. I became director of the San Francisco Ecology Center, and we took all the burlap and posters off the walls and put up, we started to get an environmental art gallery. We started a vegetarian lunch program. We invited other environmental groups in to share the space to help with the rent and the expenses. We invited people to use the facility at night for classes and meetings and press conferences. And we wound up being a self-sustaining, dynamic project. And if you think about it, what happened as a result was actually the germ for Fort Mason Center, which was shared space, activities that would come and go, self-sufficiency. And so Annie, our dear friend Annie Styron at the time, knew the people who were founding Fort Mason Center and told them they should talk to me about working there. They did, and I was hired in 1978 and worked there and brought that same model, which was, how do you create, we had all these buildings, all this space, and in a town where space was very dear. It was hard for nonprofit organizations, cultural organizations, to find places to produce that were affordable to produce events. And so I said, here's a great opportunity. We had 350,000 square feet of space in 10 buildings. How do we effectively use this to reflect the culture, the history, the ecology, the natural, human and the natural history, environmental history of the Bay Area, and do it in a way that's self-sustaining. So we began, yeah.
For our viewers who aren't familiar with San Francisco, Fort Mason was a army or naval?
It was a former port of embarkation for the Sixth Army, beginning in the early 20th century, leading up until 1962. So from about the teens until 1962, it was the major port of embarkation for any Army activity in the Pacific. And it was a historic site, but it closed in 1962 because it was where materials and troops were shipped out to the Pacific. And as air transport took over, Fort Mason became less needed, and eventually they closed it for financial reasons. And it sat basically just a storage space from 1962 until we took it over in 1978.
And it's right on the water, just to the west of Fisherman's Wharf area.
Between Fisherman's Wharf and the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah.
And 3 piers that reached out onto the water, large open spaces, and then 7 other warehouse buildings. And so we just incrementally began inviting nonprofit groups in to produce recreational, environmental, performing arts, visual arts, education, social services. And it was pretty much an immediate success. After 3 years, we were 100% self-supporting. We had grew to a point where there were 700 different organizations using the facilities every year, producing somewhere between 12 and 15,000 discrete activities, classes, meetings, conferences, exhibits, performances every year. And the place continues to this day. In fact, an hour after our interview stops, I'm making a presentation to the executive committee about a project that I want to bring to Fort Mason, which is a climate change museum. And to use the one remaining building that would suit this project. And they're very interested. So I'm making a presentation to the executive committee. And then later in May, we'll make a presentation to the full board about the same project. And I'm working with a man named Paul Hawken, who you may be aware of.
Yeah.
Who I spoke to about this project, and he said, let's do it. So Fort Mason continues to be a place that can respond. I developed it in a way that it had some permanent ongoing users, and then a lot of space set aside for changing activities, recognizing that the needs of the community would evolve over a period of time. So we always wanted to have space that could accommodate those changing needs. Mm-hmm. And now here, 42 years later, I'm bringing one of the changing needs to Fort Mason, and there's a space that can accommodate it. And it's kind of, it's a heartwarming validation of the concept of balance that I felt was important in developing the place.
Now, whose original brainchild was it? You said there was already a group?
There was a board of directors and a woman named Ann Howell, who for about 6 months was the first. She hired me. She was the first executive director, and about 6 months after she hired me, she left, and I became executive director and remained in that position for over 20 years, and then stayed on for 3 years after that, from 1999 to 2002, with my successor, helping him move into the job and supporting him in doing it. While I was commuting to San Diego from 1999 to 2007 to help them convert a former naval base into their own version of a Fort Mason Center in downtown San Diego. So they saw the value of this as a community asset, a cultural asset, something that would contribute to the health and vitality of the community. And so the city, developers, and community groups approached me about coming to San Diego. I did it. I commuted for 8 years, and it's now called Liberty Station. It's a multi-use community with housing and hotels and restaurants, and 26 buildings that are dedicated to cultural activities. You should check it out, Liberty Station. And the part that I worked on was Arts District Liberty Station. And it was a wonderful project, and it demonstrated again how keeping your mind open about how to use a space, rather than come in with your own idea, ask people what they think would be an important addition to the cultural life of a community, listening to everything people have to offer, and then sorting through that and picking a place to start and watching it grow from there. And just like ecology, just like the natural world, some things will grow, some things will stabilize, some things won't catch on, but some of the other things will move into the space that they occupied, or something new can come in to occupy the space. So it was like a good environmental model, ecological model. And it goes back to, again, not just Fort Mason, but the experience at the Ecology Center, how that affected my mindset. How does the natural world grow? How does it evolve? And then to try to bring that consciousness, that thinking, and that strategy to the development of a project. So that kind of, so I've worked on smaller projects since then, but it's been wonderful to see the health and vitality of particularly the last two big ones, the Fort Mason Center and the project Liberty Station in San Diego, how they have grown and become strong and important parts of the community.
Mm.
So now I'm hoping that this climate museum will be the next project and maybe the last big one that I take on.
Uh-huh. And there's a famous vegetarian restaurant there too. Is that?
In Fort Mason,
Yeah.
Green's Restaurant.
Yeah.
And they've been there since 1979, very successful.
Did you have anything to do with bringing them in, or?
Well, they came in after I become director, yeah. But we were talking to them when I came in on board, and but I negotiated with them and we developed the lease. And I used to joke with them, no one has served me more meals in my life than Greens, except my mother, because I used to eat there a few days a week at lunchtime at least while I was, recruiting groups or doing fundraising for Fort Mason projects. Probably ate there 1,000 times over the 20 years that I was working there. Yeah, so there's been a lot
to have at a place like that to draw people in and
yeah.
resource. Now, I remember visiting you there a couple times, and the first time I was escorted back to your office, and this was in the days when hugging wasn't popular.
Yeah.
You welcomed me with a big hug, and we were kind of tittering that, wow, we're changing the culture. So.
Well, Jack, that's how I've worked all my life, and I mean, but the difference now, of course, pre-COVID-19, is that I ask permission.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I still want to do it and will do it, but I respect the fact that not everybody wants to do that. So I will ask, and sometimes people will say, "I prefer not," and I understand that.
Now, when I met you, you were mainly over, this was just before it must have been 77.
Yeah.
You were with Annie and you brought in, or she did, some of the unusual Marin people. I'm trying to remember the guy that I'd emailed you about that had the magazine, Common Ground.
Oh yeah, sure. He was someone actually who I met in the Peace Corps training program, coincidentally, back in the 60s. Andy Alpine.
Yeah. And then
he now goes by Bahauddin Alpine.
Uh-huh.
His Sufi name.
And I think that I met what's his name from the pig farm, the famous
Wavy Gravy.
Wavy Gravy. Yeah, I think that Annie or you together were bringing these people through.
Yeah.
To the center. It was like meeting all these people wearing robes and things like that. Or
yeah. So Jack, one of the things that it was great. Not only did I become familiar with the Wellness Resource Center through Annie's work, but then you invited me to be on the board of the.
Right. Yes.
And there were a few things that really struck me about it. I mean, I used to visit, the facility there in downtown Mill Valley, but the whole focus on biofeedback therapy, meditation, breathing, good diet. It was such common sense approach to good health that it struck me, parts of that I had been aware of previously practicing just naturally, and parts that I added as a result of my exposure to the Wellness Resource Center. And, saw the benefits that could bring, the non-intrusive benefits to the person's health that offered to a wide range of people. I mean, I was very impressed with it, and really, I remember the Wellness Resource book, if I'm not mistaken, that you put out, that big workbook.
Workbook, yeah.
And
3-ring binder version that preceded the trade paperback that tends to be pressed.
Do you still have that available?
Well, it's the third edition. The first and second editions were 10-speed press, and then they moved it over to Celestial Arts.
Mm-hmm.
They had more health titles, and that was 2004. And then Random House bought them. It's fading now, but there's still some sales of it. It's probably close to 250,000 copies. But I'm just realizing that we should have hired you to take over the Wellness Resource Center, and it could have survived and flourished.
Yeah.
But then we
Well,
wouldn't
it's the kind of project that, you know, one of the things about that, if I had done that, if you had asked me and if I had done it, there was something that I didn't mention about how I decided what kind of work to do. I always wanted to recognize what my skills and experience were and how I could bring them to bear on a project in a discipline that I was unfamiliar with, so that I could not only bring those skills to that project, but also learn something new. It wouldn't just be using what I knew effectively, it would be also growing as a result of doing it. And that's been, you know, so now I'm 76, I'm still committed to growth, personal growth, not just spiritual, I mean, intellectual and professional growth. And this climate project is another example of that. I mean, I read about climate change and the problems and issues, but I know that by doing this project, I'm going to learn a lot more about it, be more knowledgeable, and be more effective in representing it in this museum that we're going to be creating. So Wellness Resource Center would definitely have fit that, because it was something I had a very, very slight familiarity with and could have learned a lot more from working on a project like that.
And because we were, that was a complete fluke for me. When I started it, I thought it was going to be me and a part-time biofeedback practitioner and a shared secretary. And suddenly we got all this national attention that we didn't really know what to do with. Got 1,000 letters after an article in Prevention magazine, and we didn't have a product to sell or any means of marketing ourselves. And so we grew and then crashed and burned because I got burned out and not having managerial skills, and we didn't take insurance, so it was a struggle financially. But
so you know, Jack, it's a familiar pattern to me, observing in society. The person who I mentioned hired me to be at Fort Mason Center, who left five or 6 months later. She had a vision for the place that I would often tell her in subsequent years, what we're doing is exactly what you wanted to see happen here. Yeah. It was her vision in a way, but she didn't have the personal skills, you know, the discipline, the focus to make it happen. And a lot of good projects don't succeed, even though what they're trying to do is important, needed, but that the person is lacking some skills that are necessary for its ongoing survival. And so that's not an unusual.
Yeah, I knew I wasn't a manager, and we've actually brought in 2 different men as managers. I actually tried to recruit a couple of others, but we had 2 of them that come in at different times. But the first one, the staff rebelled. They were too dictatorial for our egalitarian staff, and it was a struggle. But
yeah. Well, there's one other thing I want to mention that was an important and continues to be an important part of my life. My work as a consumer activist, and you may not be aware of this, but I was the plaintiff in a number of class action lawsuits against corporations for unfair business practice, lying to the consumers about what their product, where it was produced, how it was produced, what was in it, et cetera. And I did a number of these. I found an attorney who would do pro bono work on these class action lawsuits. Perrier and Jolly Green Giant Food Company, Pillsbury Foods, a few others that were misrepresenting what they were doing to the public, and I sued on behalf of the class. But the largest of these was I sued Nike for unfair business practice and false advertising for their business practices in Southeast Asia. And they were claiming that they had a Nike code of conduct that mandated the highest standards of worker health and safety, always paying workers minimum wage or more than minimum wage, no forced overtime, no corporal punishment, a variety of high standards that they set as their code of conduct. And it's admirable when a company sets those standards. Often the company then hires subcontractors who don't have the same standards. And they then say, well, we can't control how they do their work. We have these standards and we do it where we can control it. Nike went a step further and claimed that they required all their subcontractors in Southeast Asia to read the code of conduct, sign it, and enforce it. And it turned out that their subcontractors weren't doing it. There were, without going into details, there were lots of practices that were in violation. So I heard about this, and since Nike was marketing themselves as the exemplary corporation for these high standards, which it turns out weren't being upheld by their contractors, I sued them for false advertising and unfair business practice in California, because people were buying their product influenced by this image. Nike didn't countersue, but they responded by saying that even if it wasn't happening, even if what they claimed was happening wasn't happening, since they weren't saying this in paid advertisements, they were protected by the First Amendment. So they could literally lie to their consumers as long as it wasn't in a paid advertisement, literally. And I couldn't believe it, that this was their response, which was they were protected, just as I was protected if I was lying. They couldn't sue me. Since this was just being done in public statements, in letters to the editor, in letters to athletic departments, that this was all protected speech. Well, they won at the municipal court level. I found an attorney to do it. They won at the municipal court level. They won at the appeals court level, but we won at the California Supreme Court level, which overrode the previous decisions. They then appealed it to the US Supreme Court, Nike did. And the case, which had started out as Kasky versus Nike, became Nike versus Kasky at the US Supreme Court, literally. And at the US Supreme Court, which was a major deal, this was a big project. I mean, it was 2003. Kat and I went to the Supreme Court, heard the arguments, with our attorney, speculated on how we could possibly win. And 4 months later, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold the California Supreme Court decision. So we won. And this was a big deal because it didn't just mean Nike couldn't do this. It meant any corporation. There was now a law in California that said any corporation that makes statements with the intention to influence people to buy, whether it's a paid advertisement or not, if they're factual statements, they have to be true, or else they'll be sued and they'll lose. And because this was California, it really meant any corporation, because you can't say our statements are true except in California. Yeah. It was a profound decision. And I was told by corporate communications directors from Hewlett Packard and other major companies how important this decision was, because it prevented corporations from doing something that they knew ultimately was going to rebound negatively to them, and that it was important that Nike had lost this case. Well, Nike, a few years later, issued a press release acknowledging that they had dropped the ball in Southeast Asia, committed themselves to correcting it, and they had installed in their communications chain, to prevent this from happening in the future, a Kasky filter. So that if something came from marketing to communications, it would stop at the filter if it wasn't true and wouldn't go any further. The profound result of this for me personally was speaking about the importance of telling the truth for year after year while this case wound its way through the courts had a deep impact on me, to the point where I came to a place where I couldn't tell a white lie anymore. I couldn't say, Jack, I was late for dinner at your house because traffic on the bridge, if I had really forgotten and started late, I just couldn't tell the white lies. It was really a big deal. And when I was asked, right before the Supreme Court made their decision, I was interviewed frequently, national television, international media, etc., because it was a named case. They said, well, how are you going to feel if the Supreme Court, if you lose, if they vote against you? I say, well, if I lose, Nike loses, because what they would have won publicly was the right to lie to their customers. And that's not a victory for any corporation. If I win, Nike wins, because the public, their customers, can have greater trust in what they're being told being true. And it was a big moment to actually to try to find ways of characterizing things like that in simple, understandable terms. It's never in your interest to lie to your customers, your consumers, nor is it in your interest to lie to your friends.
I think we should pass this on to the president.
Well,
I had no idea that you were the guy behind the Nike thing, because that's famous. I just it was mentioned in a comedy show that we were watching a night or so ago.
Yeah.
Something about Nike.
Yeah. Well, it was it's in business school textbooks. It's in law school textbooks. I still get calls 17 years later for interviews from people doing research on similar issues, and it's something I'm very proud of, my involvement with that.
It should be. Wow. Yeah. And I had no clue.
Yeah, Kasky
Don't
versus
follow
Nike.
the news, so I wasn't aware you were at the Supreme Court, no less.
Yeah, yeah, it was a profound experience. To wake Kat and I woke up in a hotel that morning before going over to the Supreme Court, and there's a USA Today at our door in the hotel, and the headline was Supreme Court hearing Kasky, Nike versus Kasky today.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, yeah.
Now, where did you and Kat meet? And
Kat was living we met in 1994, and Kat was living in Vermont, and she was thinking of moving to San Francisco. And so she asked some friends of hers in Vermont who they knew in San Francisco. Kat's an actor, singer, songwriter, educator. And so she asked some friends of hers in Vermont who they knew in San Francisco that she could talk to get a sense of what it would be like if she chose to move here. So a mutual friend gave her my name. She called me and asked me if I'd have lunch with her. And this was actually in April, exactly 26 years ago. And she came out and we had lunch at Green's restaurant. And she told me about herself, and I, talked to her about how I saw the community and how she might be received here. Because friends of hers had told her it's very hard to find a job in San Francisco. It's very expensive to live there. It's very hard to find a good place to live. It's very hard to find a straight guy if you're a woman looking for a partner. And she wanted to get a sense of all that. So we had lunch, and at the end of lunch, we said goodbye, but I remember putting my hand on her arm, her elbow, just to touch her and say goodbye, literally to transmit energy. Mm-hmm. And a couple months later, she gave me her card. A couple months later, I got her card out and called her to see if she was moving. And I got her machine, her answering machine, back in those days. And said, by the way, if you do choose to move out here, give me a call and let me know, we could connect. And so she called me a couple of days after she moved here, a few months later. And literally, that was it. It started a relationship, and immediately, maybe within a year, she moved in with me. And within another year, we moved to the Presidio, where we've been living for the last 25 years now. Mm-hmm. And we got married 40 years after we met. We've married 21 years. And it's been a fabulous relationship for me. I mean, a very deep, meaningful relationship. And I thank previous relationships for the work they did on me to help me be open and aware, mm-hmm. so that I could really be present in the relationship with Kat. So it's been an important part of my life. Yeah, very important.
Great. Yeah, and living on the Presidio, that's pretty cool. When I came there to visit you, beautiful environment.
It's a fabulous environment. We have a wonderful house. Our house is like a community, except for now, of course. We have events we've had probably 300 events at our house. Slideshows, musical performances, lectures, belly dance classes, clothes swaps, a whole variety of things, dance parties. We've used it as a community facility. And if that an event that they happen to, who we don't know, we always say, if you have an event that you'd like to have happen here, give us a call and talk to us, and we'll see if it's something we can do. So we use it as a community facility and have for 25 years.
Mainly people in your immediate community then?
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah.
So there's quite a strong sense of like almost a village then.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's unusual. I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. In fact, in the early days, I got a call from someone high up in the management of the Presidio, a person with the Park Service, saying the people on the ground managing the place are concerned about your using the house. And I told him, this person said, let me call Mark and talk to him about it, because he knew me. He said, they're concerned you're in competition with them. And I said, no. So this is our house. We just make it available for, they thought we were going to be taking business away from them. We were doing it that much. So, but we are committed to continuing to use our house that way and make it available.
So tell me a little more about the community and how many people, what sort of.
In our community,
Yeah.
Or in the Presidio?
Well, are they overlapping or what's?
There's not the sense of, except for our neighbors across the driveway, there's really not a sense of community in the Presidio. The Presidio trust that manages it, it's managing it like commercial real estate. And so they don't there's not the focus on events, cultural activities here that we had and you need to encourage that as management. It doesn't just happen on its own. You need to not only encourage it, but make it affordable, accessible, make it an important part of what you're doing. And they have focused on the finances. They've been successful at that. They've done a great job of preserving the buildings, enhancing the landscape, and managing financially. But on the topic of creating community, it hasn't happened here. And so we've done a small thing. It's not the Presidio community that uses our house. It's people coming into our house who feel part of the community because they're engaged in an activity that's happening here.
So they're from the larger San Francisco.
Yeah, a larger San Francisco Bay
I thought
Area.
maybe you had
No.
organized the community right there on the Presidio, which would be.
Geographically, it doesn't work, and you need to have a facility that brings people together.
Yeah.
And there are some that could do that. There's some that do it a little bit, but it's not a focus. It's not a priority. And that's unfortunate, really. It's a lost opportunity so far. Still could happen, but so far, I've approached the people who were director of the Presidio Trust a few times over the years, different directors, to say that if they could dedicate just 10% of the space here to the kinds of activities that were happening at Fort Mason Center, it would have a profound impact on the way the public used and perceived and viewed the Presidio. But they have just continued to focus on their financial requirements more than that. I'll keep at it. I will keep at it as long as we're here. And I think there will be some progress, but it hasn't happened to date, really.
Interesting.
I'm trying to think, do you have any other questions? You didn't really ask me. It was really me just sort of going off on a 1 hour plus monologue.
That's exactly what I wanted. Yeah.
Oh, good.
It's good. Your history, and it more than met my needs.
I just thought of one more thing. This is actually important, if I can, Jack.
Sure.
So while I was working, one of my principles of how I work is I would never schedule myself for more than 70% of the time. I always felt it was important to have time that isn't programmed in case an emergency might arise at Fort Mason Center, some accident, some need that happened, or some staff member was going through something they needed to talk, or for me to just sit and think and stare at the wall or stare out the window at the bay. So I never scheduled myself more than 70% of the time. And what would happen is occasionally I'd get a call from someone saying, you know, I'm thinking of moving, or I'm thinking of changing jobs, or I'm trying to get out of a relationship, or I'm trying to get into a relationship, or I'm trying to kick a habit, or some issue, personal issue that they were facing. Can I come and talk to you? Because they had some sense that it would be good, that would be something good to do. So I always said yes, and I always had time for that. They'd come to my office, and we'd have a conversation, and they would leave and thank me, and I'd thank them for coming. And they would then tell somebody else, you know, you should talk to Mark about that. If there's a, you know, they'd refer me to somebody else. So over a period of, you know, 15 years, I would do this, and I enjoyed it, and I learned from it. I got better at it. And then when Kat and I started going to Burning Man together in around 2006, Burning Man's a performance place. She said, you should do this out there. Set up a table, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water, a couple of glasses, an umbrella, and put a sign on either end of the table on the playa. And out there, you can't, let's come up with a name. So she came up with Counsel from an Elder. And at that point, I was 62 years old. So that was a legitimate title. And people would just sit down and they bike by and they say, what can we talk about? And I set the table up and I said, I don't know if anybody at Burning Man is going to sit down and talk to, quote, an elder. But before the table, Kat carried the table out, she put the sign up, and before I was out there, someone said, when is the elder going to be here? So every time we went out to Burning Man, for probably 2 or 3 afternoons a week, I would sit down for 3 or 4 hours at the table, and one after another for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, someone would stop by, sit down, and talk about what was going on. Their first time at Burning Man, they feel isolated, they're kind of lost, what can I do? Or I don't know how to deal with these issues in my camp, or I'm kicking a drug habit, or my girlfriend, I can't find my girlfriend, I think she's taken off with another guy here or something. It would be some issue that they were struggling with and they needed to talk. And it wasn't really that I was giving them counsel. All I would do was ask them questions. Like, well, what have you done? Did you try this? And what happened when you tried it? Or why didn't you try that? And what I learned was that this is also a profound experience. Generally speaking, people know the answer to their own questions. They just haven't had a chance, they haven't been asked and had a chance to articulate it and hear what it sounds like and have someone reflect it back to them what they just said. And people would break down crying, we'd hug, they'd thank me. Half an hour later, they'd come by, bike by with a little gift to put on the table, you know. And so it's been something that I've done every year out at Burning Man. That we go every other year. So I've done that every other year out at Burning Man, and I still do it here. But that's something else I wanted to mention that has become an important part of my life.
Yes, counselor at large.
Counsel, yeah.
Oh.
Well, if you feel done, I think this has been fun for me to talk about myself for the last hour plus. You know.
Well, and delightful to capture this for future generations, and the reiterating like the need for people to be heard, which is exactly what you're doing with these sessions. And
yeah,
so it's a delight.
And that's actually how Fort Mason. I mean, it goes back. I listened to what I used to say. People say, "How did you figure out what to do at Fort Mason Center?" I said, "I listened to what everything that we've done here is something someone told me. We didn't do everything that everybody told us, but everything that we've done is something we were told, and that's validation of that principle. People will tell you what they think is necessary, and we needed to sort it out. But there's a lot of knowledge out there in the community.
Yeah,
just need to ask."
The shift from experts knowing it all to cooperation and
I used to say, you know, I was an amateur baseball player until I was 53 years old. And I thought about the word amateur, and the difference between an amateur and a professional baseball player is a professional baseball player does it for money. An amateur does it for love.
Mhm.
The root of the word amateur is
Amor.
amor.
Yeah.
And so I used to describe myself as an amateur executive director. That's just and to view ourselves, I continue to view myself as an amateur. I want to be doing it for the love of it, and so far so good.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
It's been a delight. I feel like I've gotten to know you so much deeper after what 45 years that we've
hmm,
known each other.
yeah. Well, it's great to talk. Great to talk to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark.
Okay, so let me see. I think I can leave. Can I leave the meeting now?
I'm going to end the recording and say goodbye.